For 28 years, the people of Acme, Washington, shared a diner, waved on the road, and unlocked their doors for someone who shouldn't have been trusted. But the most unexpected part of Mandy Stavik's case isn't who lived down the street. It's when she was pulled from the river that the state officially left the file completely unresolved. This is a story about a town that never questioned who its neighbors were. Acme was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors. Some left their car keys in the ignition overnight. If a stranger's truck rolled down the road, 3 different neighbors would notice by lunchtime. Mandy Stavik was an 18-year-old whirlwind, a 3-sport athlete who taught herself Japanese and spoke fluent English, driven by a fierce dream to become a commercial airline pilot. Her mother said she wanted to be the best at everything she tried. She'd just started her freshman year at Central Washington University. And when Thanksgiving break came, she did what a lot of kids do. She came home. The day after Thanksgiving, Mandy went for a run. Same route she always ran. Down the road, out toward the river, and back. Her mom usually rode a bike alongside her. Not this time. This time, it was just Mandy and the family dog, a German shepherd named Kira. She left the house in the early afternoon. Her brother saw her on the way back, still running, still fine, less than half a mile from home. She never made it the rest of the way. 2 hours later, Kira came home, alone. The dog's tail was tucked between her legs. She was shaking. She wouldn't go near the road. This was an old dog, a dog that had always been protective of Mandy. And now she was cowering on her own front porch like she'd seen something no dog should see. Mandy's mother knew, right away, in her gut, that something was wrong. She called Mandy's boyfriend first. He hadn't seen her. Then she called everyone else she could think of. Then she called the police. Within hours, this small town emptied out into the woods and the roads looking for one missing girl. Volunteers, search dogs, officers on foot and on horseback. People who had never met Mandy Stavik personally still spent that night walking ditches with flashlights. For 3 days, the flashlights never turned off until the search party finally hit the edge of the Nooksack River. That's where they found her. The same river she used to run past on her daily route. Her body was recovered wearing only her socks and running shoes. Everything else, her clothes, the Walkman she liked to run with, was gone, never found. Here's the detail almost nobody knows, even people who've heard this case a dozen times. The medical examiner never officially ruled this a criminal act. Cause of death? Drowning. That much was certain. Manner of death? Undetermined. On paper, this case could have been called an accident. The official record left the door open in a way that should terrify you, because it means that, for a long time, there was no guarantee anyone would even be looking for a killer at all. This is the case that would sit unsolved for almost 3 decades. The case that would end quietly, by changing how DNA evidence gets used in cold cases across the country. But none of that happens yet. Right now, in November of 1989, there's just a small town in shock, a family in the worst hours of their lives, and a file with no name attached to it. Somebody in Acme knew what happened to Mandy that day. And for the next 28 years, that person kept coming back to town. Mary Stavik had buried a child before. 14 years earlier, in Alaska, her son Brent went out on a hunting trip and never came home. He lost his life to an act of violence. No suspect, no motive, no answers. That case is still open today. Then, just 1 year before Mandy died, tragedy struck again. Her stepbrother Spencer drowned in a boating accident on a river in Alaska. He was 20 years old, 2 children, 2 violent, sudden losses. And now, this family was standing in the same nightmare a 3rd time. Mary Stavik already knew what it felt like to wait years for an answer that never came. She just didn't know yet that she was about to wait 28 more. The lead detective on Mandy's case, a man named Ron Peterson, had just come back from a training session at the FBI Academy. The subject, a brand new forensic tool called DNA. In 1989, almost no local police department in the country was using it. Most detectives had never even heard of it. Peterson had. When Mandy's body was recovered, he made sure evidence was preserved the right way. Investigators were able to pull a male DNA profile from the scene. At the time, this profile couldn't be matched to anyone. There was no national database yet. No way to run a name against it. It was just a string of numbers with no face attached. They locked it away and kept searching the old-fashioned way. Interviews, instinct, elimination. The first person the police looked at was Mandy's boyfriend. That's always where it starts. But he cooperated fully, answered every question, and his story held up. He was cleared. Next was a local drifter, a man who didn't quite fit into this tight little town. The kind of outsider people whisper about the second something bad happens. Police brought him in. They tested him. Not a match. Then came a neighbor. And this one was different. This man had actually inserted himself into the investigation, offering details, hanging around, watching how much police already knew. To trained investigators, that kind of behavior is a red flag. Guilty people love to know how close the noose is getting. He refused to give the police his DNA voluntarily. So, a judge forced the issue. A court order was signed. His DNA was taken, not a match either. In 1989, Washington state was gripped by the hunt for an unidentified monster dumping bodies near regional rivers, the man we now know as the Green River Killer. The geographic overlap was too terrifying for investigators to ignore. Could he have taken Mandy too? Investigators reached out to the task force hunting him. They compared notes. They looked at his pattern, his method, the kind of victim he chose. The answer came back: no. Wrong profile, wrong method. This wasn't him. Whoever killed Mandy Stavik was still out there, still local, still close enough to keep hearing her name every time it came up in conversation at the grocery store, at church, at the gas station. Time did what time always does to unsolved cases. It moved on without them. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The DNA sample sat in storage, useless without a name to match it to, and no technology advanced enough to search for one on its own. Detectives retired. New ones took their place. Mary Stavik kept living in the same small town, on the same road her daughter used to run down, waiting. The file on Mandy's murder didn't close. Cases like this never officially close. But it went cold. Cold in the way that means fewer calls, fewer leads, fewer people still actively looking. Cold in the way that lets a killer start to believe he actually got away with it. For over 20 years, that's exactly what happened. A whole childhood could have been born and grown up in the time this case sat untouched. Kids who weren't even alive in 1989 were now old enough to hear their own parents whisper about that girl who was murdered on Strand Road, like it was a local legend instead of an open wound. It would take a new kind of detective, one who wasn't even old enough to remember Mandy's murder when it happened, to look at that untouched sample and ask a question nobody else had thought to ask. What if you didn't wait for the DNA to find a suspect? What if you went out and found every possible suspect first, and made the DNA choose? If this case has you hooked, hit like and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. And if you want more cold cases that finally got solved, check the links in the description below. Now, back to the case. I know who killed her. Two mothers sitting on the grass at a water park are watching their kids splash down a water slide. They barely knew each other. Small talk, the kind you make with another parent while your kids play. And then, out of nowhere, one of them says it, just like that. The other woman turns and looks at her and says, "I do too." This is June 2013, 24 years after Mandy Stavik disappeared, and two strangers sitting in the sun are about to say the exact same name. Their names were Heather and Marilee. Both had grown up in this same small stretch of Washington. Both had gone to the same high school Mandy went to. Heather went first. She was 15 years old, back in the summer of 1989, just months before Mandy was killed. She'd gone to a softball game with some friends. Afterward, they all piled into a truck to get food. She ended up sitting next to a man in his 20s. He started talking about her eyes, told her they were beautiful. Then his behavior shifted, making her feel incredibly uncomfortable and targeted. She was 15. He was 21. Nothing else happened that night, but she never forgot how it felt. Then Marilee told her story. A couple of years after Mandy died, Marilee was home alone with her baby late at night. There's a knock at the door. It's a man she barely knows, saying he'd been out hunting and needed to use her phone. She let him in. He dials a number. She can hear it. Beep, beep, beep. The call isn't going through. It was never going to go through. Then he walks past her, right through her kitchen, toward her bedroom. He tells her he's been driving by her house for years. He tells her he's in love with her. He asks her to sleep with him. She had to threaten to call the police just to get him out of her own house. Both women had carried these stories alone for over 20 years, too scared, too unsure, too worried about pointing a finger at the wrong man in a town where everyone knows everyone. Now, sitting together at this water park, they finally said his name out loud. Tim Bass. He had been living right down the road from the Staviks this entire time. Not across town, not in the next county, down the road. Mandy would have run past his house nearly every single day she was home. In 24 years, nobody had ever asked him for his DNA. Not once. Merrily called a former classmate who was now a sheriff's detective. For 4 years, his unit had been running a brutal silent dragnet, testing every man who had lived in Acme back in 1989. They had checked dozens of names. None of them was Tim Bass. Now they had a name that meant something. A man who lived on the exact road Mandy ran down. A man never tested. A man whom 2 separate women had quietly suspected for over 20 years, for reasons that had nothing to do with each other. Investigators went straight to him. They sat down with Tim Bass and asked him directly about Mandy Stavik. His answer should stop you cold. He said he didn't remember her. Investigators didn't believe him for a second, so they asked for something simple, a DNA sample, just a cheek swab. The same thing dozens of other men in the area had already agreed to, without complaint, years earlier. Tim Bass said no, flat out. No explanation, no hesitation. And here's the problem investigators were suddenly facing. They had a story. They had a location. They had 2 women's instincts, sharpened by 20 years of unease. What they didn't have was enough evidence for a judge to force his hand. He knew exactly what his DNA would prove, and he had absolutely no intention of ever handing it over. So, the question investigators were left with wasn't who did this anymore. It was this. How do you get DNA from a man who already knows what it will say? Detectives followed Tim Bass for an entire night shift. Every stop, every delivery. Waiting for him to throw away a coffee cup, a cigarette butt, anything. He never did. No smoking, gloves on the whole shift. Every wrapper, every cup, every can. He took it all home with him. A man with nothing to hide doesn't clean up after himself this carefully. Investigators knew exactly what that meant. So they changed direction. They went to his workplace, a bakery outlet, and asked to speak with his boss. Her name was Kim Wagner. She had no law enforcement background, no training for any of this. Just a manager doing her job, until 2 detectives sat down across from her and told her they were investigating one of her employees. At first, they didn't even say what for. Kim didn't connect the dots until a friend mentioned a crucial detail. Tim Bass used to live on the very road where Mandy Stavik vanished. Something in Kim's stomach dropped. She knew exactly why the police were inside her building. From that point on, Kim Wagner changed. She started paying attention to Tim in a way she never had before. The way he barely spoke to anyone. The way something small could set him off out of nowhere. She started watching him at work, quietly, every single shift, waiting for one mistake. Weeks passed, then a month, then another. Tim never slipped. Kim kept watching anyway. Then, one afternoon, it happened. Tim filled a plastic cup at the water cooler, drank from it, and dropped it in the break room trash. Later that same day, he finished a Coke and tossed the can in right on top of it. Kim didn't hesitate. She walked over, reached into that trash can, and pulled both items out before anyone in that break room even noticed what she was doing. She handed them over to the police. The samples went to the lab. Weeks went by, and then the results came back. The DNA on that cup can match the DNA pulled from Mandy Stavik's body nearly 30 years earlier. The odds of it being a coincidence, 1 in 11 quadrillion. Bass was arrested in the same bakery parking lot he'd worked in for years. Handcuffs, right there, in front of the place where he clocked in every single day like nothing was wrong. And here's the detail that makes this almost too much to believe. The day police finally arrested him was the exact same day as Mary Stavik's 81st birthday. 28 years, and the answer arrived on her birthday. In the interrogation room, detectives asked Bass the same question they had asked him years earlier. Did he know Mandy Stavik? He said no, never met her, never even talked to her. Then they told him his DNA had been found inside her body. He didn't ask how that could be possible if he was innocent. He didn't ask them to double-check the results. He didn't protest. He asked one question, and one question only. How did you get my DNA? Not, there's been a mistake. Not, that's impossible. Just, how? A man who truly had nothing to do with this would be demanding answers about the test itself. Instead, Tim Bass wanted to know exactly how he'd been caught. For 28 years, he had built an entire life around never being asked this question. A wife, 3 kids, a job he showed up to every single day, blending into a town that still whispered Mandy's name at dinner tables. And in one single moment, in one small interrogation room, all of it collapsed down to a cup and a soda can he never should have thrown away. But knowing you're caught and admitting what you did are two very different things. Tim Bass wasn't going to confess. Not really. He was going to do something far more disturbing. He was going to tell a story about who Mandy Stavik really was to him. A story with no evidence behind it at all. One he had never once mentioned in almost 30 years of silence. And somehow, he was about to ask a jury to believe it. We had a relationship. That's the story Tim Bass told a courtroom, decades after the murder, after 28 years of silence, after telling police to his face that he didn't even remember who Mandy Stavik was. Now, suddenly, he remembered everything. He claimed they'd been secretly sleeping together. He said it started casually, months before her death, and picked back up the weekend she came home for Thanksgiving. According to him, that explained the DNA. Not a crime. A secret romance nobody ever knew about. Not one person ever saw them together. Not one friend. Not one phone call between them, ever, in any phone record from that year. No letter, no note, nothing. And in almost 3 decades, across every single conversation with police, Tim Bass had never once mentioned this relationship existed. Not until his DNA gave him no other option. His lawyers needed the timeline to work in his favor. So, they brought in an expert to argue the science down to the hour. She testified that the DNA evidence could have come from intercourse up to 2 full days before Mandy died. Not hours before her death. Days. But the state didn't need a new expert. They brought back the original medical examiner, the same doctor who worked this case in 1989, still standing by everything he'd found decades earlier. He testified that the physical evidence pointed to something much more immediate. Sexual contact right around the time she died. Not 2 days earlier, then something happened that no amount of expert testimony could match. His own family started talking. His brother took the stand and said Tim had once asked him to lie, told him to tell the police that he too had slept with Mandy, just to make the affair story seem believable. His own brother refused. His wife took the stand next. She admitted she had lied for him. Years earlier, she'd given him an alibi for the day Mandy disappeared. Under oath, in front of the entire courtroom, she took it back. She said none of it was true. Then came his mother. Prosecutors asked her directly if her son had once asked her to tell police that his own father, a man already dead for years, had been the one who killed Mandy. The people who knew Tim Bass longest, who loved him the most, who had every reason in the world to want to believe he was innocent, they were the ones who stood up and told the truth about him instead. The jury didn't need long, less than a day of deliberation. Guilty. The verdict came down almost 30 years to the exact date of Mandy's murder. 28 years of an empty case file, ending on almost the same calendar day it began. At sentencing, Bass was given a chance to speak. He didn't apologize. He didn't confess. He stood in front of the courtroom and delivered a long statement insisting again that he was innocent, that the trial had been unfair, that people had already decided he was guilty before it started. The judge handed down the maximum sentence the law allowed. For Mandy Stavik, this was the end of something that had never really had an ending before. Not with Mandy. Not with the son she lost years earlier in Alaska. For the first time in this family's long, painful history, a name was finally attached to a death that had haunted them for decades. It came almost 30 years too late, but it came. Mandy Stavik never got to fly the commercial planes she dreamed of. But nearly 30 years after she left for a routine run, the shadow over Acme, Washington, finally had a name.